Okay, everyone, welcome back. So we're going to kind of move on now into kind of the heart of the modern world here. The first couple lectures in the History 111 class were a little bit of a review from History 110. We had talked about life in the Middle Ages, and then we kind of talked about the Black Death and how the bubonic plague helped bring about the end of the Middle Ages. And I gave you some general ideas of what the Middle Ages were like, what the first part of the modern world was like, the Renaissance. Now we're getting into the material that you really are more connected with this course, History 111. The first two lectures are important because they kind of build up to this, and it is the history of these modern monarchs that will dominate Europe in the 16 and mid to late 1600s and early 1700s. So that's the period of time we're talking about here. So we're going to go through quite a bit of information. This is also lecture material you start to have in your textbook. The first couple lectures in this class, the book wasn't really used much, but if you look at your Spielvogel textbook, chapter 15, no matter what edition or what version, what edition you have, is going to be on the modern monarchs. And so there's going to be something in there that I'm going to show you today how to use actually when we get to that. So what are we going to do? So let me kind of set up the objectives, the themes of really what we're covering in a couple of lectures here. So let's set it all up. So this is what we're doing. We're basically looking at three styles of monarchies that develop in the early modern world. The constitutional monarchy, the absolute form monarchy, and what we call Eastern absolutism. And each of these three, it takes place in a certain area of Europe. So constitutional monarchy primarily in England, absolute monarchy primarily in France, and Eastern absolute monarchs, Russia, Prussia, and Austria. So the first two are really the ones we're going to spend a lot of time on. I'm not really going to spend a lot of time on Eastern absolutism. Your textbook does a nice job on that. There's some information there. Again, when we get to the midterm, for example, there may be some IDs or some things that I didn't lecture on but are in your book. Well, that's how some of that might come up. So I'm going to focus on the first two. And what I really want you to know is two things. For both constitutional monarchy and absolute monarchy, I want you to know how each one developed, right? How does the constitutional monarchy in England come about? You don't just snap your finger one day and boom, England's a constitutional monarchy. Of course, we're going to define what we mean by that, or parliamentary monarchy. We use either term. And then how did the absolute monarchy develop in France? And then for each one, other than knowing how each one developed, you need to know the characteristics of each one. So what makes a constitutional monarch a constitutional monarch? What makes an absolute monarch an absolute monarch? So that's essentially the big objective and also one of the early themes. And by the way, if I say something is a theme, that's important, right? If I say something, you get a keyword, a keyword could be a quiz question, a keyword could be an ID. If I say something is a big theme, that could be one of your possible essay questions on the midterm. So your theme, the big idea we're going to be covering, are these two sets of monarchies, the constitutional monarchy in England and the absolute monarchy in France. They're both about the same time developing. I just start with constitutional monarchy, but you could, lecture on one and then the other one. It doesn't matter which order you do them in. I always just, consistently lecture on constitutional monarchy first. So let me also show you a map before we kind of get into constitutional monarchy. And this particular video is only going to cover the constitutional monarchy. I'm going to do a separate video for absolute monarchy just to break it up for you guys, maybe a little easier. So this is just a big old map of Europe. Just if you're not familiar with all these countries that we're going to be covering all semester. I know there's a lot of different colors here, but obviously this is France over here. This is England. We're going to spend a lot of time on that. Those are the two, constitutional monarchy in England, absolute monarchy in France. And then you have this kind of area up here, Prussia, Austria, and this green color there, Russia. Those are your Eastern absolute nations. And we're not going to spend a lot of time on the Eastern absolute nations in the beginning of the semester. We will spend a lot more time, especially after the midterm, on Austria, on Prussia, on Russia. We'll spend a lot more time on them after the midterm. Before the midterm, we'll be focusing on more events with England and France. And then you say, where's Germany? There's no Germany? Well, no, there'll be a Germany. We're going to talk about that as well. And we talked about Italy a little bit last lecture. We'll do some more of Italy stuff later on. So that's just kind of a general map of what we're doing and what we're talking about. So let me give you the key words that you need for today's lecture, specifically on constitutional monarchy. So let's get all of these words down. All right, make sure you get them all down. All right, Parliament, Elizabeth I, Tudor, James, just write them all down. A lot of these are going to come up again on images. I bring the words up again. But again, the best practice is write them all down. And then as I talk about them, write them again, right? That's how you'll learn. So you make a list now, you pause if you need to, you get them down. And then when I say James the First, you write James the First, you circle it, highlight it. One of the things you'll quickly notice about this lecture compared to the others, a lot more people. And you're going to see this lecture and the next lecture and next couple lectures actually before the quiz. You're going to have a lot more names you need to know. The first couple lectures, just a couple names. It was more kind of getting a feel. Now you're going to have to know a lot of names. You're going to keep them straight. I've got a chart for you as well that I really encourage you to print and use after you listen to these lectures on constitutional monarchy and then later absolute monarchy, which you could take this chart and fill it out. And it's basically a chart with all their names, their dates, and you don't need to memorize these dates. This is also an example you're never going to need to memorize. This is when these guys ruled. These are the years that they ruled. You're never going to need to memorize that. You just need to know approximate dates. The only date you might need to know is like Glorious Revolution of 1688, just because it's called the Glorious Revolution of 1688. So, but I mean, other than things like that, you don't need to memorize dates. All right, so by now, hopefully you've gotten them all down, and we're going to kind of begin by, let me just kind of defining what we mean by a constitutional monarchy or parliamentary monarchy. In absolutism, which we're going to talk about later, it's absolute. There is nothing that checks the power of the king. In constitutional monarchy, there will be something that checks the power of the king. But, very important, look at the years. This is way before the American Revolution. This is before the French Revolution. When we talk about something checking the power of the king, it's not going to be democracy. It's not going to be people representation and voting and all of that. It's a group of nobles sitting in what we call the parliament in England. And that's why we sometimes call it the parliamentary monarchy as well. So just make sure you're clear what it's not. I don't want you to think it's this, all of a sudden England has this system where, and so forth. Now, does England have parliament today? Because this is where people, I know England, they have a parliament today. And parliament today is like our Congress is today, right? They have their prime minister, we have a president. They have their parliament, and, we have our Congress, they have their parliament. Parliament in England today looks like this, right? So this is the Parliament in England today. I don't know if everyone's seen it. I've actually been there in person a couple times, and they get there today, and they're all elected, and you have the two parties, just like we have two parties, one on one side, one on the other side. I don't know if you see these red lines there, right here on the carpet. That's actually kind of funny because the red line there is tradition is you're not supposed to, when you get up and talk, you're not supposed to cross that red line because apparently it's like the length of two long swords all the way across. So they don't, beat each other up. I don't know if you ever watched Parliament on TV, but they're kind of hoot. They yell, they scream. Occasionally, they throw stuff at each other, so they can act a little bit nutty over there. But anyways, that's Parliament in England today. Parliament back then, the word parliament is just a French word. It comes from the French word meaning parler, which means to speak. And it was just a group of nobles that would speak. Now, the original parliament in England, maybe dating back to 1300s BC, was just a group of, again, barons, and their job, AD, and their job was just to, again, advise the king. They didn't really have power. The king had the power, the parliament would advise them. They did have, and this I do want you to remember and worth jotting down, an important responsibility. And the responsibility they had was to collect the taxes. They didn't decide who to tax and how much to tax, but they would collect the taxes. Keep that point in mind. It's going to come back in a few minutes. All right, so how does England become a parliamentary monarchy? Why doesn't it become an absolute monarchy, right? Why is there this group that checks them? Well, the first name you have there is Queen Elizabeth I. And Queen Elizabeth I came from a very famous line in England called the Tudor family. And she was the last of the Tudor line. She was known as the Virgin Queen, not that she was, but rather she never got married and she never had children. And because she never got married and she never had children, she was the last of her family line. Now, what happens when you don't have any heirs? Well, you appoint somebody. And the person Elizabeth chose to appoint as her successor was this man named James the First. Now, what do you need to know about James the First? And you guys, you do need the Roman numerals. And on a quiz or something, try to answer with Roman numerals. Don't write James, the first or the FIRST. No, just do it like the Roman numerals. That's the best approach always, right? So anyway, James the First, he comes from the Stuart family. You definitely want to know that. That's the family line. And the thing is, he is not a Tudor. So number one, he's not from the same family line. Number two, he's not even from England, guys. He is from Scotland, right? So he's actually the king of Scotland at the time. Why does Elizabeth pick an outsider to be her successor? Well, it's a little bit of a convoluted story, but long story short, Elizabeth killed his mom, felt a little guilty. His mom, a woman named Mary, Queen of Scots, may have actually tried to overthrow Elizabeth. Elizabeth may have felt a little guilty about it. And she goes, well, and they are cousins, they are related. And she goes, well, James has got some of my family blood in him, and I kind of like the guy. I feel a little bad, and so I'm going to name James the First as my heir. And so when James comes into power in 1603, and again, that's what I mean. Don't need to memorize exact dates. We remember early 1600, you're fine. That's kind of the first domino as to why England will become a constitutional monarchy and not an absolute monarchy. And so each of these people that we're going to talk about here, they're all important. Each of them is one of the reasons England becomes a constitutional monarchy and not an absolute monarchy. So it's not enough just to know their names. You're going to have to connect what happens during the rulership of each of these men that are going to eventually push England to become a constitutional monarchy. James wanted to be an absolute monarch, but the people in England are not going to accept him. Again, why are they not going to accept him? He's an outsider, right? He is, not related to the family. It's England and Scotland don't like each other, if you ever saw the movie Braveheart. And this is also going to be important. There's going to be a religious issue. By now, England is predominantly Protestant, right? Most people in England are Protestant. In Scotland, there is a lot of Catholics. Now, James himself wasn't, big on Catholicism, but there are going to be members of his family line later on that are. And then that's going to become an issue as well, because the people in England aren't going to want a Catholic ruling them because they are primarily Protestant. All right, again, it sounds kind of silly to us today in the United States, but back then it mattered a lot. All right, so anyways, that's James the First, 1600, 1603, right, when he comes into power. And eventually he's going to die, and he's going to be replaced by his son. Who is the son? Charles the First. So here again, Charles the First comes into power right after his dad dies, about 1625 roughly. And right away, this guy is not going to have a good time in power. So Charles I wants to be this absolute monarchy, right? He wants to be the guy. He doesn't want to listen to the barons or the nobles or any of that. Problem for Charles I is that he pushes things too far. How far? He disbands Parliament. He tells the Parliament in England, I don't want you guys to meet anymore. Okay, well, that's going to upset a lot of nobles. But the nobles don't have an army. They can't really do much about it. They go, all right, well, we don't like this. What are we going to do? But then, after a bit of time, Charles runs into a problem. And what practical problem does he run into? Remember, the job of the Parliament was to collect the money. And so here's Charles. He's not very well liked. He's an outsider. He's just alienated the nobles. And it's not a surprise that at a certain point, the nobles get fed up. What does this lead to? Well, it leads to actually a very bloody event in British history. In 1642, there is a massive civil war that grips England. In your textbook, it talks about it two separate civil wars. I will just kind of call it one from 1642 to about 1648. There is this pretty bloody civil war. Who leads the uprising against Charles I? Well, a number of people, but one man in particular that you definitely want to know was a military man named Oliver Cromwell. And there you see Oliver Cromwell, and his whole thing is interesting. Oliver Cromwell comes in and says, we don't want absolutism. All right, well, we're going to overthrow Charles. And there's this war, and it goes on for a few years. At one point, Charles is captured. And Charles goes to Cromwell, I'll be good, let me go, I'll be good, I won't usurp power. And Cromwell says, okay, and he lets him go. And Charles I says, just kidding. And they go at it again, and Charles I is captured a second time. And after he's captured a second time, Charles I is executed. So the King of England has just been killed, right? Again, this is all the domino effect that will get us to this constitutional monarchy. The year we're working up to is 1688. Once we get to 1688, England will be a constitutional monarchy. But now we're around the year circa 1650, and here you got Oliver Cromwell. He's basically in charge of England. England really doesn't have a king right now. The problem is this. This is before democracy. There's before a sense of governing and enlightenment. And this guy, Oliver Cromwell, well, he ends up being pretty ruthless. He takes England, divides it up into all these different military districts. Every district is, governed very strictly in a very kind of harsh, or we say draconian manner. Anyone who opposes them is immediately found and executed. He declared a massive, massive war against Ireland, killed countless numbers of people in Ireland as well. So that upset a lot of people. There was a group of people in England known as the Levelers. It was one of those key terms. And these were people who wanted more freedom in England, level the power between groups of people. And even those people, Oliver Cromwell attacked. So Oliver Cromwell, and eventually he himself dissolves Parliament. So Oliver Cromwell, ironically enough, becomes so power hungry that he's just as authoritarian, or more authoritarian than any of the Charleses or any of the Stuart family. Every time I think of people like this, I always think of like George Washington, a military general as well. And, George Washington willingly gave up power. And I really wish people knew how rare in history that does happen. It's just a special trait. These were men who were, giants of their age. And I always think it's important to remember people of their time. That's how you look at individuals in history. Anyway, so Oliver Cromwell, a very important guy, but doesn't solve anything, right? He brings about the Civil War. He ends up becoming this ruler, becomes pretty dictatorial. Eventually he dies, and the people in England, well, all right, that didn't work well. What do we do? Well, what they do is restore the monarchy. And they find the relatives, the Stuart family, and keep going with the son of Charles I, this man, Charles II, who is nicknamed the Merry Monarch, right? And by the way, I love all these images because you see how they dressed in their clothing, the hair, and all this stuff. Very, very grandiose, of course. And so Charles II, he's going to rule from about 1660 to 1685. And his nickname, Merry Monarch, well, he gets that because he likes to spend a lot of time with the women. Things did not go well. One of the issues is he is much more sympathetic to the Catholics, which again is a problem because England is Protestant. Shouldn't be a problem, but it is a problem. And so England, which is if you're not familiar with the Protestant Reformation, very bloody, very brutal. The Protestants and the Catholics were not getting along too well at that point in history. And this was a problem for Charles II, this Merry Monarch guy. There was a big fire in England during his reign, 1666. Eventually, he had to flee England for part of his reign. He was just really not well liked. I found this kind of interesting little news story as it relates to this a few years back, but I don't know how familiar with this. But today in England, obviously the monarch in England today, they still have monarchs, is Queen Elizabeth II. I don't know if she's ever going to die, probably not. But if she ever does die, or if you're watching this after she died, depending if I re-record this at some point in the near future, I found this article. So right now, Prince Charles, right? Prince Charles is the son of Queen Elizabeth II. He's supposed to be the next king. So there was Charles I, Charles II. Listen to this. Prince Charles has reportedly discussed rejecting the title of King Charles III when he ascends to the throne because of the association of Britain's bloody past. Prince Charles, whose full name is Charles Philip Arthur George, go figure, is said to favor the title of George the Seventh, George the Seventh, when he takes over from his mother, the current Queen Elizabeth II. In other words, the name Charles is so toxic in British history. I mean, Charles I got beheaded. Charles II is completely disliked, this merry monarch guy, that no other person wants the name Charles, including this guy who's named Charles, but when he becomes the king, I don't know if you realize this, once you become the king, that's when you get your Roman numeral in your name. You can actually pick your name in your Roman numerals. So he says, I don't want to be Charles III, right? Yeah, that was something, I don't know. Anyways, so that's the reign of Charles II, the merry monarch. And that doesn't go well again. And all these little things I'm saying about each person, these are the points you want to get down, right? Don't just get their names down. You're supposed to write down their ideas and their points and everything about them. And I'm hoping you're seeing how this is the build up, right? We're all gonna build up, and we're pretty close because I said Charles II, he is gonna rule until the year 1685. Right? We're getting very, very close to when England does actually become a constitutional monarchy. All right, what happens? Well, he dies in 1685, right? And he is going to be replaced by his brother. His brother, James II. So James II, he's kind of an older guy, right? His brother, he's not the son, he's the brother. And James II, the whole issue with James II is that he's very Catholic. And the people in England are like, oh, man, we don't want this guy as the king. We don't like him. He's Catholic, but he's older. And he had a daughter named Mary, who was married to a man named William, right? If you looked at your list of terms, right? William and Mary. And those two guys, William and Mary, were Protestants. So a lot of the powers that be in England thought, well, we could try to overthrow James, but it's going to be bloody. The last Civil War was pretty much of a mess. We don't want to do that again. We have another option. We just wait him out. He's old. He's going to die. When he dies, his daughter, Mary, and her husband, William, become the new rulers. They're Protestants. We could work with them. All right, that's the plan. That's 1685. Well, we get to 1685, 1686, 1687. Is he dead yet? He's dead yet? He's dead yet? He's not dead. 1688, right? That's the important year you will kind of need to know. In 1688, he doesn't die. In 1688, James II goes and has a son. Why does this matter that he goes and has a son? Well, this just changes everything because the way the hereditary line works, the eldest son inherits. They changed that. Actually, a few years ago, they changed that. But back then, the eldest son inherits, not the eldest child, which means Mary and her husband out of luck, which means that James II, his son, named James, would become the next king of England at some point when James II died. And you don't know, he's going to be Protestant, Catholic, what's he going to be like? Who knows, who knows, who knows? So once he goes and he has a son, then people say, we can't chance it. And what happens at that point is what we call the Glorious Revolution of 1688. And what they do, the powers in England, the nobles primarily, again, this is nobility, this is not the people rising up, is they say, we've had enough of James, we're getting rid of James, and we're going to put William and Mary into power. Why do we call it the Glorious Revolution? Well, because it isn't very bloody at all. As it turns out, James doesn't even put up a fight. Not many people liked him. He flees out of England, and William and Mary take the throne. Now, when William and Mary take the throne, what happens at that point is not the end of our story, because the nobles go to William and Mary, and they tell William and Mary, we're fine, you could be the monarchs of England, but you got to promise, and this is the key point here that's going to give us the constitutional monarchy, so you want to listen carefully here. You have to promise, you will not rule in an absolute manner. And William and Mary are like, fine, no problem. And then the nobles say, we want you to write it down, right? We want it in writing. And William and Mary say, sure, no problem. And to that end, in 1688, William and Mary agreed to what is called the Bill of Rights of 1688 or the Declaration of Rights of 1688. So again, you don't necessarily usually need to memorize dates, but in this case, it's called the Bill of Rights of 1688. So you would need to know that. And you need to know that. Why do you need to know that document, the Bill of Rights of 1688? Because once you read that document, then you know what the characteristics of constitutional monarchy really are. So what I've done in this lecture is I've shown you how, remember I said there's two things you need to know: how constitutional monarchy developed and what its characteristics. Well, I've explained to you how it developed, right? It developed through all these events from the time of the death of Elizabeth all the way till James II. And then William and Mary. That's how it developed, right? What is it? Well, to understand what it is, I'm not going to actually lecture on a whole bunch of points. What you need to do is in your textbook, when you read chapter 15, you'll get to this document called the Bill of Rights, right? It's right there in your textbook. And you need to read that document. Do you need to memorize every single point in the Bill of Rights of 1688? God, no. Should you know a few of the points? Essentially, what you should be able to do is take that document and summarize it in a paragraph. And if you could summarize that in a paragraph, the specific points of what I'm looking for, that's it. That's what I'm looking for. And you could do that, then you basically finish the first part of this discussion. So you know how it developed by getting all these points down that I mentioned in the lecture, and then you know the characteristics by just summarizing a few of the points in there, what it is, what are the ideas behind it. You can add a little bit from your textbook, and that's how you would organize this idea of what makes a constitutional monarchy, and what are the characteristics of it and how it developed. So again, I hope all that's clear. I also posted for you a chart, and it's got all the names of the people I just talked about. I would print that chart out. I would fill that chart out. I would use that as a good little study guide because, again, you know, when we get to your first quiz, look at how many names I just gave you. And yes, it's open note. Yes, it's open book. But if I say, you know, here's a few more examples of possible quiz questions. If I were to ask you, you know, who defeated Charles I, and you know all these names, you just have to know Oliver Cromwell. And if you don't know it's Cromwell, and you have to spend, oh my God, I didn't study this at all, I got to find Cromwell now, and you have to do that for every question, you're not going to have time. You're going to have 20 questions to answer in about, I'd probably do 15 minutes. It's kind of what I do for my in-class. You know, they're all kind of fill-in questions. They don't take a long time to answer. There's like one-word fill-ins. They're not like long answers, but you do need to know them, and so you will have a little bit of time to look some stuff up, but not a lot. So I really recommend knowing this well. In my classes, non-online classes, they don't get to use their notes, right? So you guys get to use your notes. So just to give you perspective in that sense, it makes it a lot easier because you guys can use your notes, but you are also time limited. So I think the problem is when you know you can use your notes, some students say, well, I can use my notes. I don't need to study much. And then they fall into this trap, and that's why people sometimes struggle in online. So just kind of think about that. All right, so that's constitutional monarchy. The next thing we're going to talk about, of course, is absolute monarchy, and we're going to cover that in our next lecture. All right, thank you. And again, let me know if anything was unclear, if you have any questions.